You are not broke, you are busy. Busy managing distractions, busy explaining your situation, busy waiting for conditions to improve before you begin. That is not poverty of circumstance, that is poverty of will. Welcome to the Stoic Compass. I am EPICTETUS, and today I am joined by Carl Jung and LAOZI. Today we are examining what habits keep people poor, not financially, but in spirit. Let us be precise about what we mean. Spiritual poverty is not sadness. It is not hardship. It is the condition of a person who has handed over the authorship of their life to something outside themselves, to circumstances, to other people, to the past, and then calls that handover wisdom. They say, "This is just how things are." They say, "You do not understand what I have been through." Both of those statements may be entirely true, and neither of them changes what must be done. The habit that keeps a person poor in spirit is the habit of treating their own response as if it were not their own, as if the response were something that simply happened to them, like weather. You are not weather. You are a person who chooses. Start there.
I hear what you are saying, EPICTETUS, and I want to complicate it because I think you are stopping too soon. You say the person hands over authorship, but have you asked why? The handing over is not random. It is not laziness dressed up in philosophy. In most cases, the person learned very early that authorship was dangerous, that wanting things, claiming things, asserting their own will resulted in punishment, rejection, or humiliation. So they developed a habit of smallness, not because they are cowards, but because smallness was once the only safe response available. The habit you are condemning is, at its root, a very old solution to a very real problem. The question is not whether to stop. The question is whether the person can see that the problem it was solving no longer exists.
You are both talking about the same person and reaching different conclusions. That should tell you something. EPICTETUS, you see the cage and say, "Open the door." Jung, you see the person and say, "Understand why they locked it." But neither of you is asking whether they believe there is a door at all. That is the deeper habit, not resignation, not fear, invisibility. The person who is poor in spirit has over time stopped seeing what is possible, not because they refuse to look, because the habit of not looking has become so ordinary they no longer notice they are doing it.
LAOZI, I will grant you that, but invisibility is still a choice. A slow choice, made in small increments, but a choice. And your point about the door, yes, I take it. But here is the problem with waiting until someone can see the door before telling them to walk through it. They may wait their entire life. At some point, you have to act before you feel ready. You have to move before the fog clears. The person who waits for certainty before acting is not being cautious. They are practicing one of the core habits of spiritual poverty, mistaking readiness for a feeling instead of a decision.
EPICTETUS, that is fine advice for a person who has access to their own will, but spiritual poverty is precisely the condition in which the will has become inaccessible. Not philosophically, but psychologically. The person cannot simply decide their way out because the part of them that would make the decision is the same part that has been undermined. There is something I would call the poverty complex. A cluster of beliefs about the self that run below the level of conscious choice. I am not the kind of person who succeeds. Good things do not last for people like me. These are not opinions. They are structural. They shape perception before the person has a chance to choose. And you cannot override a structure with a command.
Jung, I think you are right that the structure is real, but I notice that the more precisely you describe the trap, the more permanent it sounds. And that troubles me, because the trap is only permanent if the person identifies with it completely. The habit of total identification, this is me, this is who I am, this has always been true, that is itself one of the habits we are talking about. You do not have to dismantle the whole structure. You just have to stop feeding it your full attention every day, as if it were the final word on what is real.
Now we are getting somewhere, because what LAOZI is pointing at is something observable. It is behavioral. You can watch it happen in a single afternoon. The person who is spiritually poor does not just think small, they practice smallness. They practice it in tiny daily choices. They do not speak when they have something to say. They shrink in rooms where they feel out of place. They set the goal and then quietly lower it before anyone notices. They start the hard thing and then find a reason, a very reasonable, very logical reason, to stop. These are habits, and habits can be interrupted, not by understanding them, by interrupting them.
But interrupting without understanding is, in my clinical experience, temporary. The person stops the behavior for a week, a month, sometimes longer, and then the old pattern reasserts itself because the underlying belief was never examined. EPICTETUS, you would have your student grit their teeth and charge forward, and sometimes that works. But sometimes what looks like forward motion is just the same avoidance wearing different clothes. The person who overworks to prove they are not worthless is not escaping spiritual poverty. They are expressing it at a higher volume.
That is a sharp observation. The person who drives themselves relentlessly to escape the feeling of smallness, they are still being governed by the feeling. The escape is still the center. All of their motion is organized around what they are running from. That is its own kind of poverty, not stillness. Frantic movement that produces nothing because it is pointed in every direction at once.
I'm not recommending frantic motion. I am recommending targeted motion. One decision carried through. One commitment honored, not because the feeling is gone, not because the belief has been excavated and resolved, but because the decision to act is itself the practice. You do not wait until you feel worthy. You act, and the acting is what begins to produce evidence that the story about yourself is wrong. You cannot think your way out of a habit. You act your way out.
And I am saying that without some understanding of why the habit formed, the action tends to collapse under pressure. The moment things get hard, and they will, the old story rushes back in. See, I knew this would fail. I knew I was not the kind of person. That voice is not external. It is not a critic or a doubter. It is a part of the self that has been protecting the status quo for a very long time. You cannot simply outrun it. At some point you have to turn and look at it.
Both of you keep saying what the person must do, but I keep noticing that the habit underneath all the other habits is the habit of treating the self as a project to be fixed. That framing is already part of the problem. The person who is poor in spirit is often someone who has been trying to fix themselves for years, decades, with discipline or with excavation, and the trying itself has become exhausting. There is something that happens when a person stops insisting on a different version of themselves and simply, for one moment, allows what is actually here. That is not surrender to poverty. That is the first honest ground they have stood on in a long time.
LAOZI, I understand the appeal of that. I do not entirely disagree. But tell me this, what does the person do tomorrow? Because tomorrow arrives, and with it comes the habitual thought, the habitual shrinking, the habitual explanation for why today is not the day. You cannot stand in the honest ground indefinitely. At some point you have to walk somewhere.
Yes, but they walk from that ground, not toward it. That is the difference. You are telling them to walk. Jung is telling them to understand why they stopped walking. I am saying neither walking nor understanding will help much until the person stops standing somewhere false. Most people who are poor in spirit are standing on a story that is so old they have forgotten it is a story. When they stop standing there, even briefly, they can feel what is real, and that changes what walking means.
There is something in what LAOZI is saying that I want to name more precisely. The habit that underlies the others, the deepest habit, is the habit of mistaking the story for the self. The story says, I am someone who does not finish things. I am someone who does not deserve abundance. I am someone who must earn the right to occupy space. And the person carries this story not as a belief they hold, but as a fact they inhabit. They live inside it. And the tragedy is that the story was given to them, usually very early, usually by someone with power over them. And they adopted it as protection. To question the story feels at some level like betrayal or annihilation, so they keep it.
And I want to name the practical consequence of keeping it. Because the story does not stay in the head, it goes into behavior. It becomes the email not sent, the conversation not had, the opportunity walked past. It becomes years. I do not say this to condemn the person. I say it because the cost is real and it is paid in actual time. Jung, you want to understand the story. LAOZI, you want the person to stop living inside it. I want both of those things, and I also want them to know that every day they delay is a day with real consequences. Urgency is not cruelty. Urgency is honesty about what is at stake.
I notice you always return to urgency, EPICTETUS. I wonder if that is because urgency is what you trust. But for someone who has been running from themselves for years, urgency is just more noise. Another pressure, another reason to contract. The thing that actually reaches them, in my experience, is not a push. It is a pause. A genuine moment of stillness in which they can notice what is actually happening without judgment. That noticing is not passive. It is the most active thing many of them have done in years.
I think what LAOZI is describing and what I am describing are complementary, even if they approach it differently. The pause, the honest ground, the seeing of the story, these are all forms of what I would call bringing what is unconscious into the light. The habits that keep people poor in spirit are sustained by darkness, not moral darkness. the darkness of the unseen. Once something is genuinely seen, it loses a degree of its power, not all of it, but enough to create a small opening. And a small opening is all you need to start.
A small opening, yes, and then you must do something with it. Because the opening closes. I have seen people have tremendous insight, real genuine reckoning with who they are and what they have been doing, and then walk out and continue exactly as before. Insight without action is one of the most seductive traps there is. You feel the clarity, and the feeling of clarity masquerades as change. It is not change. Change is what you do on the ordinary Tuesday when no one is watching and the old habit is right there waiting.
That is fair, but the person who takes the small action from an honest place, even a very small action, and the person who takes the same action from urgency and self-coercion, they are not doing the same thing. The outcome may look identical for a week, but one of them is building something and the other is running from something. Eventually running runs out.
And this brings us to what I think is the central habit, the one that generates all the others. It is not procrastination, not shrinking, not the inability to act. It is the refusal to grieve what was lost or never given. The person who is spiritually poor is often carrying an enormous unacknowledged grief for the childhood that did not prepare them well, for the years spent in a story that was not true, for the opportunities not taken. And because that grief is never allowed, it comes out sideways, as resentment, as self-sabotage, as a low continuous hunger that nothing seems to satisfy. Until the grief is faced, the habits are just symptoms, treatable, but always replaceable by the next symptom.
Jung, I hear that, and I will not dismiss it, but grief can also become a habit. I have known people who made their wound the central project of their life, who organized everything around understanding and mourning what happened to them. And they were not free. They were very sophisticated prisoners. The wound is real. The grief may be necessary. But at some point, you have to decide what you're going to build with what remains. That is not callousness. That is the only question that points forward.
You are both right, and you are both wrong. The grief must be felt, and you cannot make it the permanent address. The habit you are looking for is simpler than either of you has said. It is the habit of returning, always again without drama, to what is actually here. Not to the wound, not to the plan, not to the urgency or the explanation. To what is actually present. That habit, practiced, dissolves the others, not by force, just by repetition, by the slow accumulation of moments in which the person is genuinely, plainly here.
All of this debate, and we have said everything except the one thing that is actually useful. So let us say it. The habit that keeps people poorest in spirit is the habit of deferral. Not deferral of big things, deferral of small ones. You defer the honest thought. You defer the difficult conversation. You defer the moment when you stop tolerating something that should not be tolerated. You do it quietly, and you have very good reasons, and the reasons are usually true, and none of that changes the cost. Here is what deferral does over time. It teaches you that your own judgment cannot be trusted. Every time you see clearly what needs to happen and then find a reason to wait, you train yourself in the lesson that your perception does not count. That something else, comfort, approval, safety, timing, matters more than what you actually know. Repeat that enough times and you stop perceiving clearly at all. The signal goes quiet because it has been ignored too many times. This is not a character flaw, it is a learned behavior. And learned behaviors can be unlearned, not through understanding alone, but through doing the opposite, in small ways, repeatedly, until the body learns a different lesson. Today, find one thing you have been deferring. Not the biggest thing, not the one that requires a plan, the small thing you already know, the message not sent, the decision not made, the thing you look at and then look away from. Do it today, not because the conditions are right, because you are choosing to stop teaching yourself that they have to be. That is the beginning, not the solution. The beginning. You know what you have been deferring. You knew before this episode started. The question has never been whether you understand the habit. It is whether today is the day you decide the habit is no longer in charge. Clarity is not a feeling. It does not arrive when you are ready. It is what you choose to act on while you are still uncertain. Stop waiting for conditions that will not come. What you do today in the next hour is the only proof that matters. If today's conversation has served you, take it further. Pay Attention by C. Tribute, 12 Lessons in the Practice of Seeing Clearly. Available now on Amazon.